I like making decks that make people question their preconceptions about deck building and about the EDH format as a whole. And one of my favorite examples of this is my Glissa deck. It is a battlecruiser deck that uses its command zone to give it a consistent, high-quality early creature, thereby allowing the cards in the 99 to be a pile of greedy, high-cost nonsense. Just look at that beautiful monster of a curve. This sort of massive nonsense tribal deck is really fun for when I don't want to play a deck that is particularly challenging, and would prefer to just indulge my battlecruiser desires. But unfortunately, there's a problem. This deck plays a shitload of removal to disrupt opposing game plans, and this works out quite well for the deck's general game plan, ramping to a double-digit land count as fast as possible and then turning on the boss music. But this game plan can be a bit contentious at times. Not so much that I never play it, but enough so that it can't be my default mid-power fun deck for when I don't want to think too hard. People get annoyed if I spend too much time as the final boss. All this to say, for the past 6 months, I've been vaguely looking around for a battlecruiser deck that might be able to scratch similar itches while being a bit less brutal to play against. A little while back, somebody mentioned to me the idea of running Rada Heir to Keld as a commander, and this got my noggin jogging. You know what sucks to draw in the late game? Low-cost ramp spells. Any ramp deck worth its salt needs to coordinate the ratio of ramp to other stuff, and also the ratio of low-cost ramp to high-cost ramp. Running a lot of low-cost ramp leads to beautiful curve-outs and buttery smooth early to mid-games, but it also leads to running out of cards faster, and worsens the quality of later-game top decks. I built a Goreclaw deck a while back that ran 16 low-cost ramp spells, with the goal to land Goreclaw on turn 2 or 3, and then vomit out a massive amount of power and toughness on turns 4 and 5. The deck did a great job of accomplishing exactly that task, but it pretty much either won quickly or ran out of steam after eating a couple removal spells or a board wipe. Running a lot of draw is the best way to avoid this in a deck that runs a lot of low-cost dorks, but despite my best efforts, I couldn't manage to cram the necessary amount of draw into the deck without incurring a substantial cost to the beefiness of the deck. On the opposite end of the ramp spectrum, there's the option of running a lot of high-cost ramp instead. This preserves top deck quality and lessens the number of cards needed to achieve the same degree of ramp. However, it will lead to slower games and fewer keepable hands, worsening a deck's mulligan phase and its ability to get off the ground. But what if there was a way to do the inverse of what was done in the Goreclaw deck, to have the commander cover the low-cost ramp, and then run a massive pile of 4-cost ramp? This is where Rada comes back in as a 2-drop mana dork that's available at all times. One potential Rada build could be to run a lot of 4 to 5 cost plays, but these tend to be a lot worse than 6 to 7 cost cards. Dropping a generically high-quality 4-drop on turn 3, such as Forgotten Ancient or Atsushi, is a lot less impressive than dropping a Kogla or an Atali Primal Storm on turn 4, and creatures that are 6 or more mana also tend to stay relevant as top decks, whereas 4 to 5 mana creatures are, by contrast, often kinda disappointing to top deck later in the game. This is not to say that we're going to be trying to let the deck get to a point where what's on top of its library is all important, but when you're playing a cheap red-green mid-range deck, you gotta know that there will be some games where you don't find enough of your draw, and end up relying on the heart of the cards. And in those cases, you'll usually be glad to draw a Dragon Lair Spider instead of an Arasta. So this was my start in building Rada, 4-cost ramp that I can play on turn 3. There are some different options here, including some really potent mana dorks that might allow for an extra explosive turn 4 to 5, but I made my decision of what to put here largely with the intent of hedging around a potential weakness for the deck. See, green stompy decks tend to struggle with one type of card above all others, board wipes. And while mana dorks often allow for faster acceleration than other types of ramp, they have the downside that they generally get eaten by board wipes alongside the big threats that prompted the wipe. A big goal for this deck was to be able to ramp relatively quickly into 6 and 7 drops, but also being able to play through hate and keep scaling into the late game. The ramp suite I ended up landing on focused on a classic, Explosive Vegetation. I run all 10 of these effects that exist, as well as Blighted Woodland, an untapped land that can also serve as turn 3 ramp if I activate it during combat after attacking with Rada. From there, the deck ventures into a bunch of other cards that perform some sort of ramp function, including extra land spells, like Mina and Den, filtering cards that produce treasures, such as Unexpected Windfall, and a handful of other cards. Since I want some sort of ramp on turn 3 every single game to allow me to play a 6-drop on turn 4, I opted for 19 total cards that offer turn 3 ramp. That gives a 79% chance of drawing one in each opening hand, a figure that is high enough to leave some room for needing to mulligan for lands. With my core idea of the deck consisting of Rada and a pile of 4-cost ramp, I had a question on my hands. How much low-cost stuff should I run? I knew that it wouldn't be a big amount, and I eventually decided on literally none at all, and this is for one key reason: Cascade. A big downside of Cascade is how luck-based it is. When you play a 5-cost Cascade card, it might hit a 4-cost card, but it also might hit a 1-cost card. However, if you simply don't run any cards that cost less than 4, you're guaranteed a pretty decent minimum level of value from your Cascade trigger. This fact, paired with my density of ramp on 4, means that Cascades and Discovers are actually reasonably predictable. Cascading for a 4 or less cost card yields an 85% chance of finding a card with some sort of ramp attached, and cascading for a 5 or less card yields a 2/3 chance of finding specifically a ramp spell, but an additional 14% chance of finding a card that cascades for 4, which I must remind you has an 85% chance of finding a ramp spell. Cascading for a 6 or less cost card has a more modest 40% chance of finding a ramp spell, but if we account for the Cascade and Discover cards, this ends up getting boosted up to a 55% chance. What this silly jumble of numbers means in practice is that the deck is effectively running a high 20s number of ramp spells, and all of them ramp for at least 2 mana or have other upside. Translation? We're in Lands Town, baby. So what does the deck spend the resulting mana on? As I alluded to earlier, a big place to spend this mana is on 6 to 7 mana creatures, as these work well both late and as a juicy turn 4 play. A lot of these are exactly what you'd expect: Atali Primal Storm, Rampaging Baloths, a decent handful of Cascade creatures, but some others are a bit further off the beaten track, and this is motivated by a couple factors. For one, I wanted to build this deck on a pretty tight budget, both for the sake of my wallet and to force me into some more creative directions, so nothing over $4. Secondly, the deck ramps very hard and has a very high curve, and there are cards that work well with this. One such card is Screamer Killer, a card from the Warhammer 40k set that's shockingly close to being a terror of the peaks in my deck, but at a tiny fraction of the price of that fancy dragon. Another favorite of mine is Emergent Woodworm, a card that's so underplayed and causes such a large swing in board the turn it enters that I frequently have opponents do a double take and ask, wait, that card does what? I also run Tyrant's Familiar and Thunderfoot Baloth. These are quite powerful with a commander in play, but most decks can't take full advantage of them, because opponents can simply remove their commander before attacks, which ends up being a soft 2-for-1. However, since my commander is a mana dork that I don't really care about past turn 4 or 5, my opponents are far less eager to remove her, and she's pretty cheap to replay to get the Lieutenant ability back online if they do remove her. A big theme among the rest of the Rada deck's high-cost creatures is something that it shares with my Glissa deck. A large portion of the deck's creatures have some sort of removal attached. This is great, as it allows the deck to pack a lot of ways to deal with opposing threats, while also allowing the deck to put on pressure by having a large density of big creatures that it starts playing on turn 4. The deck also packs some amount of draw, but far less than you'd expect. There are 7 engines and 2 one-time draw spells, and while playing the first dozen or so games with the deck, I've kept expecting to need to add more draw. But it just hasn't been necessary. The deck does a perfectly fine job maintaining resources in its hand. This once again goes back to the mana curve. Even though the deck gets massive land counts, since roughly a third of the deck is creatures that cost 5 or more mana, it often stocks up a handful of large threats earlier in the game, giving it plenty of time to find a draw engine as it builds up its land count. This is supplemented by the Cascade Explosive Vegetation plan, which thins the deck of lands, and to a lesser extent ramp spells, helping it to draw into more big threats later. I'm broadly not too impressed by the effect of deck thinning in Commander, as a couple fewer lands won't have a wildly meaningful impact on a deck that is looking to win by turn 8 or 9. Scale this up though, and pulling 8 or more lands out of a deck that is looking to grind way into the late game does start to become decidedly more impactful. The confluence of the Rada deck's intense density of ramp, vast number of high-cost threats, and adequate quantity of draw ends up being a deck that stockpiles all game resources at the same time. It develops board while ramping hard and maintaining plenty of resources in hand. And this fact leads to the deck's biggest strength, its flexibility. Against faster decks, it can dig in its heels and focus on staying alive until it has the resources to stabilize, knowing it'll easily outscale the other decks later in the game. Whereas, against decks that go bigger than it in the late game, the deck can advance a bunch of large creatures and turn them sideways to get that deck down to a manageable life total before it gets too scary. The deck also plays through most hate just fine. It doesn't run significant numbers of artifacts, enchantments, graveyard synergies, or pivotal singular creatures. Board wipes are basically the only commonly played hate in EDH that causes problems for a turbo-ramping big creature deck, and the deck plays decently well through these too. Advancing a few threats is all that's needed to have a board wipe-worthy board state, and this generally leaves plenty of beefy stuff in hand, and far more lands than opponents for purposes of playing that stuff back out. The deck's cascade creatures are also a thing that feels perfectly fine to play into a board wipe, since they usually find some sort of ramp that can help the deck bounce back more quickly after the wipe. Before I spend too much time indulgently hyping up my deck, I should talk about the downsides of the deck. For one, it lacks basically any instant speed interaction. If I'm being generous, it has a grand total of 4 instant speed removal cards and 1 instant speed protection card. This is mostly a product of the deck being a cascade deck that runs no cards below 4 mana. The desirable options for instant speed interaction are pretty slim. In addition, the deck is extremely consistent in early turns, an attribute that comes with both positives and negatives. The positive is that as long as it mulligans properly, the deck basically never has do-nothing games. The downside is twofold. For one, it can be a little boring, since the deck has basically no meaningful decisions between the mulligan phase and turn 4. The other issue is that it's predictable, since opponents who have played against the deck know its rough curve out of the first 4 turns. The fact that the deck is locked into this curve out is another reason why I opted for the $50 budget. It literally cannot increase the speed of its curve outs, so any deck that's doing something substantially more relevant on turn 4 than playing a 6 or 7 drop beater is too far above the deck's power level to be worth trying to match. The deck also requires a very aggressive mulligan policy to make sure it is able to get off the ground okay, though at least it usually does fine starting with 5 or 6 cards. All of these downsides are pretty fundamentally tied to the deck's core construction. Having a deck with no cards costing less than 4 mana still curve out at a decent speed requires making some concessions here and there. At the end of the day, the process of building this deck was the process of chasing a vibe. It's the vibe I was chasing with my first Commander deck, it's the vibe I was chasing when I made Glissa Cruiser, and it's a vibe that I'll hopefully call it quits with chasing now that I have this Rada deck. This vibe of having all the resources, of being the big bad at the table, of playing mid-range to the bleeding edge of what that term can possibly mean, I just find it super fun, and I think it makes for a cool table dynamic as long as the deck in question has enough interaction. To me, building a deck that satisfies a particular feeling is one of the best parts of Casual Commander, especially if the resulting deck ends up being strange and unique. The challenge of making a deck that is conceptually cool, enjoyable to play, and good for table dynamics is a fun one to navigate, and when it works out, the results can be really great. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll be posting an endnote to my Patreon tomorrow where I discuss some of the weirder choices in the deck that didn't make it into the video. That's right, I didn't even talk about the Caves package. I'm also currently taking submissions for a bonus video later this month, where I give my thoughts on 3 patron decks, so if you want the chance of having your deck reviewed by me, you can sign up for my Patreon and submit your deck within the next week.